From the Center for Investigative Reporting and PRX, this is Reveal. I'm Letson. At Amazon fulfillment centers, most of the on-the-job injuries come from bad ergonomics. They're caused by repetition, working in awkward positions, or putting strain on the body, and they're a huge problem in other industries too. Hotel maids whose backs are blown out from decades of lifting mattresses to change sheets. Poultry workers with chronic nerve damage from hanging 10,000 chickens headed for slaughter each day. OSHA requires companies to protect workers from common injuries in all kinds of industries, from construction to logging. But there's no federal rule to protect workers from ergonomic injuries. To understand why, you have to go back in time. Reveals Jen Gollan takes us there.
Actually, you have to go way back to the year 2000. The movie Gladiator is huge. Everyone is watching the TV show Survivor, and there's this famous Budweiser commercial. That's around the time when Devonda Rogers started working at Budweiser, running quality control tests on the beer.
We're testing it for iron. We're testing it for ammonia. We're testing it for different bacteria to ensure that it's safe for the public all around.
7 days a week for 13 years, Devonda did small, controlled hand motions, swirling flasks, holding shaking centrifuges. Budweiser's testing instructions always ended with, repeat it again, to ensure that we're getting the same result. Devonda started to notice something about her hands. Her fingertips started going numb. Then came intense pain from her neck down to her wrists. One day she walked onto the factory floor and grabbed a case of beer for testing.
And I dropped the case. At that point, I thought I was going to pass out. I went down on one knee and I just thought a bolt of lightning hit me.
Devonda saw doctors who told her she had carpal tunnel that was work-related. Physical therapy helped relieve the pressure on the nerve in her hand, but when Devonda returned to work, the pain always rushed back. It got to the point where she couldn't unscrew a water bottle cap. She filed a workers' compensation claim against Anheuser-Busch, the company that owns Budweiser. The next year, she says they fired her for being unable to keep up with her job. Then, when her daughter was an infant, this happened.
I picked her up and she hit the floor. And I will never forget that scream and that look that she gave me. It was a look of, I can't believe you just dropped me, and she was screaming.
She kept fighting Anheuser-Busch for workers' comp, but Devonda says company managers refused to accept that her injury was work-related. We asked Anheuser-Busch for an interview and sent them specific questions about Devonda's case, but they never responded. There were no government regulations to protect Devonda, but what she didn't know was right around the time she started working, there almost were.
Most American workers had no ability to stop bosses from abusing them with dangerous workloads. The unions were fed up, workers in other industries were fed up, and we finally had the ability to set those limits.
That's Eric Fruman. He's a health and safety director for unions. He represented garment and warehouse workers, and he was a voice pushing for ergonomics protections. And President Clinton's Labor Department, they're listening.
We are compelled to act. Employees are getting hurt. Workers are being sent home. People are suffering. It's time for OSHA to move on.
There was a lot of momentum behind the rule, which would have forced companies to limit how much workers could lift, bend, or twist, and how many times they did the same task. It was a decade in the making, and one of the last steps in the process was a series of hearings for public comment. That's when a team of lawyers representing Anheuser-Busch, hundreds of other companies, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce descended on the Capitol.
I would think that it would be a very good idea if no one sits in those first couple of seats in the first row. Otherwise, you run the risk of getting run over by an attorney rushing to get to the podium.
This is a hearing room in Washington, D.C. in 2000. It looks like an auditorium for a school play, except with a judge and a bunch of OSHA bureaucrats sitting on the stage behind a long draped table.
See, the gentleman, I think here in the third or fourth row had his hand up.
The gentleman in the third or fourth row was one of the lawyers representing Anheuser-Busch and the others.
Just 1 minute, I have an audio-visual item.
He awkwardly carries a whiteboard out of the darkness and onto the stage. He tries making a joke about back injuries.
I'm not going to ask you about my lifting technique. I just want
Okay.
He returns to the podium at the foot of the stage and gathers his papers.
I'm Eugene Scalia. I'm representing several clients in this rulemaking, including the...
He's a slender 30-something guy with dark, intense eyes.
If I could begin, and I'll direct my questions to Ms. Kent.
Oh yeah, and he happened to be the son of a sitting Supreme Court Justice, Antonin Scalia. He launches into a cross-examination like you'd see in Law and Order.
If a physician said that that employee needs to sharply curtail activity for a period of time, would you regard that view as wacky?
Even though there was a lot of science to support ergonomic protections from things like repetitive motions or assembly lines that move too fast, Scalia attacked it. He called it junk science. Baruch Fellner was Scalia's teammate at these hearings.
The one thing that this country and that no workplace can afford is for some scientists to stick a finger up in the air with a wet part and say, oh, this is where science is going.
For the scientists, it was rattling. What's the emotion that comes to mind when you think of that experience?
Intimidating. This was tough cross-examination.
Bob Harrison was a researcher and doctor who treated injured workers. He remembers Scalia grilling the scientists at the hearings, interrupting them as soon as they got into any detail, saying things like, I don't think I'll permit you to waste my time in that way, and evidently you think that's a silly exercise.
It's a well-practiced attempt that I now understand to doubt myself and doubt my own credibility and research as a doctor and a scientist.
Scalia had another tactic he used to cast doubt on the connection between repetitive motion and ergonomic injuries.
So if you have 95 papers that show there's a link and 5 papers that show that there's not a link, it's pretty easy to make hay out of the 5 papers that show there's not a link.
Not only did Scalia tear into the science, he went after regulators, drilling OSHA's experts with hypotheticals. At a House subcommittee hearing, Scalia says a worker could hurt himself playing football on the weekend. Eric Fruman was sitting right next to Scalia when he said that.
You would think that a lobbyist of that stature, working for one of the largest law firms in the country, with extraordinary access to corporate resources, would have been able to find an example of that if it existed. And run it up the flagpole and bring in the papers from the contested workers' comp hearing where the employer had the photographs of Johnny Jones playing football on Sunday and then coming into work on Monday, reporting an injury, signing it, and the employer fighting that all the way to the Court of Appeals in the state of God knows where, and the judges saying to the employer, you're wrong, this guy's entitled to comp. Except he didn't. And he never tried to bring the facts to bear. He was just good at peddling fear.
As good as Scalia and his team were in doing that, late in 2000,
government guidelines aimed at making the workplace ergonomically correct.
the Clinton administration enacted the ergonomic rules,
which would affect all workers except those who are self-employed or in the agricultural...
Unions were thrilled.
Well, it was great that we won. This was the set of rules that were going to free American workers from abusive workloads, give people the feeling, blue-collar workers, manual workers, low-wage workers, that the government actually could do something for them.
Or could it?
It's possible for the country to have such a division as we do.
Doris.
Uh-oh, something's happened.
George Bush is the president-elect of the United States. He has won the state of Florida, according to our projections.
After one of the closest presidential races in U.S. history, George W. Bush and not Al Gore moved into the White House, and Republicans took Congress. Within months, ergonomics were being debated again.
The clerk will read the joint resolution for the third time.
Senate Joint Resolution 6, providing for...
And this time, they dusted off a little-known law called the Congressional Review Act. It lets Congress take a second look at any rule made by a federal agency and vote on it.
No. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond, aye. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman.
Everyone in labor and industry was watching.
Yeah, I was at my office both days in New York. I guess I was watching it on C-SPAN.
The yeas are 56, the nays are 44, and Senate Joint Resolution 6 is passed.
The ergonomics rule was repealed. How were you feeling at that moment? Did you have...
Heartbroken. Absolutely heartbroken.
Do you remember what you did in those moments after it failed?
And I probably went out and got a drink or something. I was pretty miserable.
It was the first time a regulation had been repealed this way. And here's the other thing about the Congressional Review Act. Once a regulation is overturned, agencies are forbidden from writing another one like it. In the end, Scalia won, and he quickly vaulted into government. Not long after, he was nominated labor solicitor, which is the Labor Department's chief lawyer. They play a major role in enforcing many federal labor laws and developing rules. At his confirmation hearing, Senator John Edwards had a simple question for Scalia.
Would you agree that one of your responsibilities for this position that you've been nominated for would be to represent the laborers, the working people around America?
My responsibility would be to represent the government of the United States and enforce the laws.
I show a video of that moment to Eric Fruman.
It took him 7 seconds to figure out that was his answer, and never once did he mention lifting up America's workers.
Then, last year, President Trump nominated Scalia for Secretary of Labor.
Place your left hand on the Bible, raise your right hand, repeat after me. I, Eugene Scalia, do solemnly swear.
I, Eugene Scalia, do
Under Scalia, the number of workplace safety inspectors dropped to a 45-year low at the start of the year. And despite the dangers of COVID-19, the Labor Department hasn't issued any rules to limit the virus's spread among workers. I wanted to talk to Scalia about this and his work fighting the ergonomics rule, but his office never got back to me. So I asked his former partner, Baruch Fellner, how Scalia's done.
I think his performance as labor secretary has been extraordinary and exemplary. And this country is blessed to have individuals of his intellect and talent willing to sacrifice for the public. And I would hope that that would be a quote.
This made me wonder about Devonda Rogers, the Anheuser-Busch worker who has crippling pain from her neck to her hands. These days, she's on disability and can't work. She takes 7 different pills a day for pain and depression. When I tell her the history of the ergonomics battle, her reaction is, wow. What would you like to see Scalia do that would make you feel better about the state of ergonomics in this country?
I'd like him to do what he's supposed to do for the American people. I'd like him to say, okay, look, I know the people that put me here, but I need to hold those people accountable.
What do you think that says about our nation, that there are no rules around ergonomics?
It puts profit above people, just plain and simple. Just work you to death until there's nothing left.
That story from Reveal's Jennifer Gollan. The death of the ergonomic rule 20 years ago had a domino effect. Some states tried passing similar regulations, but failed. Only California has an ergonomic rule on the books. And how many citations have they handed out in 5 years? Just a few. Back when Budweiser was fighting ergonomic regulations, it was selling beer using ads and commercials. These days, online reviews have become important to sales. But should we believe them?
The reviews read like advertisements to me. There was common language through many of the reviews.
That's next on Reveal.